I am the daughter of parents who were remarkable, not for their professional achievements, though those were significant, but for the steadfastness and joyousness of their parental love. My father was a professor of statistics, and my mother was a university administrator, and they raised my siblings and me on the campus of the University of Nigeria in Nsukka. Nsukka was a slow and small and utterly lovely place in the early 1980s, the last gasp of the university's sparkling age. The campus had entrance gates with security guards in uniform, many of them elderly men with gentle demeanors. Before each car drove through, the driver would stop, get out of the car, and open the boot, or the trunk, as I am now compelled to say in America. Checking cars as they left the campus was really a ritual and a symbol of apartness and specialness, a reminder that the campus was not part of the larger town. It was a world of its own, safe and gently superior, with its own churches, one Catholic, one Protestant, a children's library, a medical center, a staff primary school, a swimming pool, a tennis court. And when the general electricity was cut off, the campus generators came on. This was the kingdom of my childhood. It was a happy childhood, but I'm not sure I knew at the time that it was a happy childhood. It seems to me that we often recognize happiness only in retrospect. Or maybe a happy child just goes through life too busy being happy to think of being happy. Childhood creates our worldview. My father died in June of 2020, and my mother, shockingly, painfully, only months later on my father's birthday, March 1st. Nothing has left me as shaken and as broken. It has brought to me a new definition of childhood, a time when I thought my loving parents would always be there. The writer Isabel Allende, who writes very wise and deeply felt fiction, once said, "I was such a sullen, angry, sad kid." I'm sure there are writers who have had happy childhoods, but what are they going to write about? No ghosts, no fear? What are we going to write about indeed, those writers with happy childhoods? It is not so much that we would have nothing to write about, I think, as it is that we might approach our writing differently. It is not the absence of ghosts or fear, but that the preeminent impression of childhood is not ghosts and fear. That someone was there to hush you through the fear and clip the wings of the ghosts. And because the ghosts were conquerable, you hold your pen differently. When I was 5, my father was appointed Deputy Vice Chancellor of the university and was assigned a new house on campus. And so we moved from number 13 in Banefu Street to number 305 Margaret Cartwright Avenue. I remember the house as it was then, a light blue 2-story house in an expansive compound, the green hedge of whistling pine, the row of purple bougainvillea, the white lilies that shrank and died each harmattan and then magically flowered again when the rains came. The yellow roses by my mother's garage, the trees in the back, avocado, cashew, mango, and the tall, lonely oil palm. I remember playing badminton with my brothers on the lawn. We used a rope as our net and then argued interminably about whether the shuttle had gone over or under. I remember the frangipani tree that we climbed and from which I once fell, a fall that left a mark on my arm. And because I am spatially challenged, it is the mark that I now use to tell my left from my right. It's true. I remember that the guava tree had a kind of elegant slouch to its branches, and it was on its thickened stem that the fluffy white chickens bought in the market were tied before our house help killed them for Sunday lunch. I remember riding my bicycle up and down the slope of Margaret Cartwright Avenue. All the other children loved going downhill, but I hated the loss of control. And so I went, not fast and thrilled as they did, but slowly, carefully cradling the bicycle's brakes. I remember the disgustingly flat, oversized cockroaches that crawled in with the rainy season and smelled utterly horrible. We called them American cockroaches. They were not the usual smaller Nigerian cockroaches, and I'm not sure why they were called American cockroaches, but perhaps it is not unreasonable to label as American anything that is larger than normal. I remember our gardener, whose name was Jomo, watering the plants with a metal watering can, and my brother, Okay, following him around, listening to Jomo's stories. One day, Jomo told Okay a story different from his usual animal tales. He said his eyes had once been red, bright red, because he had fought in the Nigeria-Biafra War and had killed people, and the blood of those he killed had stained his eyes. But after the war, he did a cleansing ritual where he swore that he had not killed any innocent people, and right afterwards, his eyes lost the redness. My brother must have been about 10 and I about 7, but the story stayed with me, strange and dark, and also somehow redeeming. Many years later, I wrote my novel about the Nigeria-Biafra War, Half of a Yellow Sun. There is a character in the novel called Jomo, who is Jomo and also not Jomo. Just as when I am writing fiction, I am me and also not. Proust has famously written about the novelist's different selves, how the self that writes fiction is different from the everyday self who goes shopping and eats and goes for a walk. I am different when I write fiction, not entirely unhinged from my other self, of course, but different still. A kind of heightened, liquid, suspended state of being, cerebral, but also deeply intuitive, spiritual even. An ancestral bequest, an ancient condition. With a writing process like mine, it is difficult not to believe in, or at least engage with, faith. For to write as I do is to be acquainted with the possibility of mystery, of the unknown and the unknowable. In writing fiction, I surprise myself, just as characters surprise me. The writer Elizabeth Bowen said that writers do not create characters, but have to find them because they pre-exist, an idea that appeals to me. Sometimes when I talk about a character surprising me in the course of my writing, I am met with suspicion, understandable suspicion. What do you mean the character surprised you? I mean, you wrote the bloody book. But in this case, I do truly believe myself. I believe myself too when I say this. I did not choose writing. Writing chose me. Nobody has expressed my relationship to my writing as perfectly as Zadie Smith did in a lecture while speaking of her own relationship with her writing, and so I will quote her. I experienced writing as a permanent emergency state, believing if I devoted time to anything else, I would run out of time and then not have the time to write what I felt I had to write. But why this urgency exactly? Nobody asked me to write. I have to resort to a medieval and unfashionable word, vocation. I felt writing was my vocation. That's where the quote ends. Vocation, an old-fashioned word indeed, but no less accurate for being old-fashioned. I do not know a time when I was not drawn to story, to human emotion, to human motivation, to dreaming and thinking, to watching and to seeing. This is all I have ever known, this longing, this sense of being always one step removed, one step apart and watching the world. Writing's grip on the emotional boundaries of my life is inflexible. Without it, my sense of who I am would shrink almost to nothing. If I did not have the good fortune I have today to be published and to be read, for which I'm very grateful, I would be somewhere unknown, but writing. I have this memory from childhood. I'm sitting in the backseat of my mother's car as we drove to the market, and I'm looking out of the window, and suddenly I feel an intense pang of melancholy, because what I saw through the window as we drove were stories, so many stories, and I knew that I would not be able to tell them all. The writer John Updike said this about writing: we must write where we stand. Wherever we do stand, there is life, and an imitation of the life we know, however narrow, is our only ground. We write where we stand. And at the beginning, I stood at number 305 Margaret Cartwright Avenue, University of Nigeria Nsukka. It was in that house that I first began to write. I wrote sitting at my father's desk in his study. I wrote in lined exercise books. For Americans who don't know what exercise book is, look it up. It has nothing to do with working out. Oh, I thought it was important. I mean, we could talk about language later, but I sometimes think that translation is interesting because you have to think about what words you leave in their original state. You know, do you say boot or trunk? When you're talking about my childhood, I would say boot. But anyway, so exercise books. Or I wrote at the dining table, often first clearing away food flasks and newspapers and bananas and whatever else had been deposited on that hallowed family dumping ground. It was at that dining table that we gathered when the Nigerian military took over the government in a coup, and then in another coup. Each time, the martial music with its ghostly strains, the voice of the army officer, the queasy uncertainty of political choicelessness. Before we moved into number 305 Margaret Cartwright Avenue, the previous occupant happened to be, in an odd bit of coincidence that would later gain significance, the acclaimed writer Chinua Achebe, who was also a staff of the university. I did not think much of this growing up. After all, university staff moved in and out of university housing. Until many years later, when my first novel was about to be published here in the US, my editor asked me to tell her about my life. And I did. And then I added, oh, by the way, Chinua Achebe lived in the university house in which I grew up. And she said, her eyes wide, that is the most interesting thing you have told me about yourself. And so at that moment, I resolved to make sure that this was always included in my biography as one of my life's great achievements. It was in that house that I began to read. Susan Sontag wrote that reading, the love of reading, is what makes you dream of becoming a writer. But for me, the reading nourished the dream. It walked alongside the dream, but it was not the origin of the dream. They were related, of course, but I recognized the desire to write as more primal, as if reading was a great passion and writing was simply me. I remember the books of my childhood as physical things, some with covers torn off, spines cracked, others with the stiff and transparent plastic cover from the library. I remember books as mood and place, reading curled up in bed during heavy rains, reading as I ate at the dining table, and I remember books as absolute luminous pleasure. I read everything except for fantasy. Perhaps because the world seemed to me so interesting and layered that it felt like an unforgivable evasion to inhabit imaginary worlds while the mysteries of our own world were yet to be fully deciphered. Books nurtured my writing. My earliest writing were imitations of the British children's books I read. But so did watching the world and listening, from the small gradations of life in Nsukka to my mother's King Lear-esque insults swiftly delivered in Igbo whenever she was annoyed. Nkita la chaganya. May a dog lick your eyes. Kitipa babuigi. May chicken pox strike you down. No. I see my mother now through childhood eyes with her effervescent beauty, her charm. She was keen always to welcome everyone and feed everyone. There was always so much food in our house. She was wondrously ambitious. She became the first woman to head the non-academic section of the university. Her name was Grace. And I just want to pause here. There's a baby at the back of the room whose name is also Grace. And she is my parents' first great-grandchild. And my parents did not get to see her. And she's called Grace. And she's just the most wondrous gift that my family has. And I'm so delighted that she's here. And I think she might become a writer. We're starting early. My mother's name was Grace, and in her secondary school days, she was called GC London because she was known to speak English beautifully, therefore the London. But nobody was as inventive as my mother was when she issued her insults in Igbo. And just one last one I'll share with you. Neki di kikabi. She once told our house helpers, and it translates literally to, you have the backside of a scorpion. And the poor guy who was being reprimanded actually burst into laughter. I grew up bilingual, as did almost everyone I knew in that small university town in southeastern Nigeria. We spoke English and Igbo at home. Sometimes we spoke English and Igbo in the same sentence, as do some characters in my novels. Before I published my first novel here in the US in 2003, an editor suggested that I remove the sprinkling of Igbo words because, she said, they would confuse American readers. I happened to have just read Saul Bellow's novel, Herzog, and feeling a little smug and a little clever, I asked the editor, have you seen the long paragraphs of untranslated French in Herzog? Of course, I understand that French is a much more familiar language to the American reader than Igbo is, but they're both languages, both valued by those who speak them, both worthy. And literature is our last frontier for a true picture of our world as it is, the polyglot, multifaceted, multi-everything. The writer Louise Erdrich has written about Native American languages rapidly dying off because the Bureau of American Indian Affairs humiliated and punished Native American children for speaking their languages. Yet, she wrote, the omnivorous nature of a colonial language is a writer's gift. In place of gift, I might invent another word for a gift that isn't quite a gift. A thing imposed on you, but which you now own. Wait, what was that? There's a story there. And so in place of gift, I might invent another word that means a gift that isn't quite a gift. A thing imposed on you, but which you now own. For English is mine, as much as Igbo is mine. I write in English because English is the only language in which I can write, which in turn is because the language of education in Nigeria is English. In primary school, we were not allowed to speak Igbo in class. It was called speaking in the vernacular. And the word vernacular was wrapped in shame. I look back now at the absurdity of it and also the great sadness of it. How colonialism's most insidious legacy is its ability to make you denigrate that which is yours. But many of us did not succumb to this ignoble shabbiness. And in my case, I think it was because of the stories my father told us. My father was a radiant storyteller, and he spoke a beautiful Igbo, unsullied by Anglicizations as ours was. He told stories of his childhood and folk stories and stories his father had told him. I loved the proverbs, the wit, the humor, the wisdom, and I would soak them all up, absorb them, store them, and I began to feel a distinct sense of pride about the Igbo culture from which these stories came. Pride at my good fortune to have come from a wise and humorous and enterprising and just people. An almost epic sense of personal history, which caused me to assume my place in the world as unquestioned, just naturally so. As a child, I may not have questioned my place in the world, but I asked many questions of the world. I was educated in a Nigerian system in which questioning was not necessarily rewarded. In secondary school, I always got straight A's, which would have pleased any parent. But each last day of term, my stomach would tighten with anxiety because my teachers often wrote comments about what they termed my lack of respect, which invariably led to stern parental talks. Lack of respect was really my roving, restless curiosity, my delight in intellectual argument, my refusal to accept easy answers, my reluctance to perform a certain kind of exaggerated deference. I see now, looking back, that I could very well have been an annoying child. And yet, I wish the adults who had formal authority over me had known how to guide my questioning. Many of my questions were about religion, or more specifically about the Catholic Church, because I was raised Roman Catholic. And I was immersed from birth into a life of religious ritual. We went to Mass every Sunday, all dressed up. And after Mass, we drove to town to buy newspapers and snacks. I was drawn to the rituals of Mass, of benediction, of confession. How could a creative child not be? The rich dramatic potential, the mix of pathos and hope. Paschal Mass at Easter stands out in my memory. So many people gathered together outside at night, holding their candles high. I would look at the sea of flickering candles, the lights like stars low enough to reach out and touch, and I would cry, deeply moved by the sight and the symbolism. My family's Catholicism was moderate but conservative, the African permutation of Roman Catholicism with its subtle and not so subtle disparagement of pre-Christian Africa. To be baptized, for example, you had to choose an English name, because the reasoning was English was Christian and African languages were not. Years later, as an adult, when I decided that I no longer wanted to have an English name, an acquaintance said to me, "So you won't have a Christian name?" To which I said, "I do have a Christian name, it's Ngozi." Attending catechism classes was a central part of my childhood. And there we learned Catholic doctrine. And there too, I asked questions about limbo, where the souls of babies floated and waited. About burning forever in hell, yet not being consumed. Once the teacher, we called him brother, said there were questions one should never ask. And I recoiled fiercely. Because even as a child, I recognized that my vocation is rooted in the imagination, and the imagination is the home of questions. Why? How? Where? And most of all, what if? I am fascinated by faith, the human need to make sense of the mystery that is our existence, and the humility of acknowledging that there is so much we do not know and perhaps cannot know. Mine is a respectful, probing fascination, wistful, even admiring, but always pitilessly clear-eyed. I am fascinated by the genuine embrace of a religion brought to you in the most irreligious way, as part of that harsh, soulless dictatorship called colonialism. I am fascinated by a source of comfort that can also distort your life, by the ease to extremism, being righteous but not being right. My first novel, Purple Hibiscus, has a father character whose blind Roman Catholic religiosity has terrible consequences for his family. After it was first published, I was often told by Americans and Europeans that my novel was a political allegory, that my abusive father character represented Nigeria's brutal dictator. Why, I wondered, must my characters represent something political? Obviously, I know the reasons, that modern African novels have their roots in the anti-colonial struggle, and that so little African writing is known outside Africa that the easy response is always to read it first as political anthropology, rather than as a story of human beings. But it does not change the truth, which is that when I sat down to write the father character in Purple Hibiscus, I was not thinking, I shall now write an important allegorical representation of Nigeria's military culture. Instead, a character had come to me with a hushed voice and an almost broken spirit, a teenage girl who was nothing like me and who I wanted to explore. I should clarify that my questioning this was not because I disagreed about my work being political. I agreed that it was. Rather, I questioned it because it seemed that some writing was read this way and others were not. And this distinction was based not on the content of the writing, but on the personal history of the writer. A kind of categorizing based not on literary judgments, but on lazy cultural assumptions. Because unless we insist on a narrow and incomplete definition of politics, what today is not political? In that sense, then, all fiction is political simply because the writing does not exist in a vacuum. All stories come, even if obliquely, from social and political realities. W.E.B. Du Bois once said that all art is propaganda, and this is the kind of statement that is very easy to disagree with because of the ideas we have about art and about propaganda, where the former is pure and the latter is a kind of deliberate spreading of often insidious information. But when we think about a more nuanced meaning of propaganda, then Du Bois becomes easier to agree with. And here's a quote from Du Bois. All art is propaganda and ever must be, despite the wailing of the purists. I stand in utter shamelessness and say that whatever art I have for writing has been used always for propaganda, for gaining the right of Black folk to love and to enjoy. I do not care a damn for any art that is not used for propaganda, but I do care when propaganda is confined to one side while the other is stripped and silent. Du Bois was speaking in the context of what he called Negro art, the art of African Americans who were not allowed by the white establishment to write about certain subjects. But in a larger sense, perhaps Du Bois was saying that we cannot pretend that literature falls from the sky, unburdened by value or by history. She agrees. When I read English writers I admire, such as Graham Greene and Virginia Woolf, I am being delighted and entertained, but I'm also learning of a certain sensibility, a certain Englishness. And yet, it would not be the instinct of the average reader to think of such writers as political. And so, my prickliness on this issue is based on my belief that, as Horace wrote, the goal of literature is to instruct and delight. And we must allow African literature to do both. When I'm at book events, so this is the part of the speech that I might have to change now, but I think I'll say it anyway, and then I'll revise it. So at book events, I can always tell who is studying African literature from their questions. And these are the questions that least interest me because of their insistence on everything being post-colonial, because of their deadening preoccupation with theme rather than character, and because of the realization that characters in African novels are not likely to be conceived as sources of delight, or that they're too often seen as characters to whom bad colonial things happened. Bad colonial things did happen, indeed, are still happening. And yet, I long for my characters to be seen, as Toni Morrison said of her characters, as characters who are unavailable to pity. This tendency to read African literature as anthropology or as political allegory fills me with a kind of wistful resentment, especially when I hear students speak of their favorite of Louisa May Alcott's women, or which of Jane Austen's characters were really badass. But I'm now going to revise it because because Kajatan has made me rethink my single story of literature programs, and again, I really want to thank you. I do think that his words represent a change. I'm sure I'm outdated, but at least 15 years ago, this was the norm, 10 years ago even. And I would often be frustrated at not being asked about love and despair and human motivation and all of those complicated human things. I was so sick of being told that somehow my characters were about dictatorship or whatever the hell else. And so in addition to politics and anthropology, I have discovered that part of being an African writer in the world is to be expected also to be an activist. I've often been told, of course, you must write about the political situation in your country. Or actually in other countries. Someone said to me not long ago, why haven't you written about Congo? And what I did not say to that well-meaning person was, because actually I want to lie in bed and read poetry. Because this is true, I do want often to lie in bed and read poetry. But at the same time, I do also often write about the political situation in my country. I recently wrote a public letter about the Nigerian elections because I wanted to tell the story of what happened. And telling the story of what happened has become important in a world so eager to deny and distort even recent history. I wrote it to bear witness. I want to bear witness because I can. And because I can, I believe I must. But I don't think a fiction writer must necessarily be politically engaged, especially an African one. The only role of the writer, wherever they come from, is to write literature. Because really, it's a never-ending enterprise. Cormac McCarthy put it really well when he wrote, "You always have this image of the perfect thing which you can never achieve, but which you never stop trying to achieve." Like most Igbo families, we had a second home in my father's ancestral hometown, Aba. And it was to this home, or the village, as we called it, that we journeyed at Christmas. Our house was a 2-story building. There was a red gate, a sandy yard. Once my mother attempted the planting of flowers in our yard, but some stray village goats made their way into our compound when the gateman neglected to close the gates, and these resourceful animals saw in the red and yellow flowers a perfectly colorful feast. And so that was that for flowers in the village. In my part of Igbo land, pythons are considered sacred. My sister Ije, who is the grandmother of baby Grace, told me a story of a python she found curled in my grandmother's outhouse years before I was born. My sister was terrified, but my grandmother merely walked over and spoke gently to the python, asking it to please leave so as not to scare the children. The python then uncurled itself and slid away. There were many other stories I heard in the village of people turning into animals or going to secret nightly meetings in the bottom of the sea. These stories were told with the ordinary tone of the mundane. So when I discovered years later a genre of writing called magical realism, I felt a kind of resistance to the name because I knew of this world where the so-called magical was seen as real, and therefore the qualification of magical was unnecessary. I did not need to believe these stories. I respected how much they shaped the lives of those in my village who believed them. To be back in my village today is to feel a sense of an almost atavistic belonging. It is quite simply my home. It is where I want to be buried. And this rootedness to my ancestral hometown, this metaphysical attachment to a physical place, is very freeing to the creative impulse. I can roam as far as I want because in my mind, there is a home waiting, always there. The highlight of those Christmases in the village during my childhood was the masquerades. The big masquerades appeared with much noise and music and commotion, and children were filled with excitement at going to see them. They were violent, flogging one another with long sticks and sometimes thick ropes, and they were beautifully grotesque. One Christmas, the big masquerade, which was called Abonatumbe, which I should translate, it means the snake that does something to the tortoise. I just realized the translation doesn't sound terrifying enough, but this masquerade was terrifying. And it appeared only once in many years. I was excited until I was told I could not join my brothers at the gate to peek out as this masquerade went past. Why? I asked. Well, because girls can't. The stark and unrelieved unfairness of this made a huge impression on me as a child. It also felt like one of the many things adults did that just wasn't very sensible. It was my introduction to the parts of Igbo culture that decreed that simply by being born female, you were automatically excluded from so much that was beneficial. You could not inherit property. You could not participate in the most prestigious ceremonies. You could not have an equal say. The Igbo people pride themselves on historically being an island of democracy in a sea of autocratic kingdoms. And so just as we speak of universal ideas when we mean male ideas, ancient Greece as the cradle of democracy, even though women could not vote, and we speak of the Renaissance, even though women were excluded from intellectual life, and we speak of the Enlightenment, even though women could not control their property nor have higher education, so too Igbo land. It was indeed decentralized and democratic, but it was a male-only democracy. This story of the masquerade is one I pull out from time to time to illustrate a kind of political awakening to my existence in the world as a woman. It is a convenient story and a true story, but it is incomplete because it is too simple. My awakening happened before then. I had already observed the tiny nuances in language, how a professor, for example, was called strong, and a woman professor like him was called arrogant. How a relative whose husband brutally beat her was told to go back and beg him because a woman without a husband was nothing. I already knew that it was women who died of broken hearts, not men. That women were socialized to give value to romantic relationships in ways that men were not. Children notice subtleties at very early ages. I did not, of course, have the language for what I sensed and saw, and it was years before I came to know that word feminism, which for me is a way of dreaming of a more just world. That great African icon, Thomas Sankara, said, "The revolution and women's liberation go together. We do not talk of women's emancipation as an act of charity or out of a surge of human compassion. It is a basic necessity for the revolution to triumph." And for me, in place of revolution, I like to insert other words like progress, justice, or even peace. And I wish that African leaders today would read Thomas Sankara. But for all of my enduring dedication to feminism, I recoil whenever I am described as a feminist writer. I am not a feminist writer. I am a writer who is also a feminist. To add the label of a movement before the word writer is to take a rusty, jagged knife and hack at the sublime. We should have political causes close to our hearts. Our work will engage with those causes because they are part of our lives. But to give its name to our vocation is to suggest something coarse, an expectation of ideological correctness. And novels should never be ideologically correct because life is never ideologically correct. Novels should be true, and truth is messy. Truth often has corners filled with contradiction. A story is a very powerful thing. Stories can take away dignity, but stories can also restore dignity. Stories shape politics and perception. I cannot tell you how many times I've been told by people from different parts of the world after reading my novels that they finally started to see Nigeria, really see Nigeria. After my second novel, Half of a Yellow Sun, was published, I was stunned by how many people embraced it as their own personal history, those who had experienced the Nigerian Biafran War. At my readings, women would start to cry and say, "Thank you for telling the story and for finally making it possible to tell my family what I went through." Men would get choked up talking about how they had been conscripted as boys. Young people would get emotional talking about how they finally understood their parents. I will never forget how moved I was to read many years ago. Nelson Mandela described Chinua Achebe's novel, Things Fall Apart. He called it the book in whose presence the prison walls came down. In this way, literature becomes more than itself. Today, African children go to elite boarding schools and learn about Greek mythology. But what is the difference between Persephone, the Greek goddess of planting seeds, and Allah, the Igbo goddess of land? It is merely that one story has been told well and the other has not. It is through stories that we can turn our myths into memory. I'm reminded of a conversation I eavesdropped on. I do this all the time. I really recommend, if there's anybody here who's thinking about starting to write fiction, and I encourage anyone who's even thinking about it to write. We need many stories. But if you're thinking about writing fiction, I really recommend eavesdropping. This is how you learn the cadence of language. And cafes are really the best venues for this. But I did eavesdrop in a conversation, and a person, an African, not a Nigerian, was talking about somebody who had said there are no skyscrapers in major African cities. And this person got very upset and said, "There's skyscrapers in Nairobi and in Lagos." And I remember listening to that and thinking, the problem with this is that somehow this African had accepted that skyscrapers should be the basis on which to measure development. We need stories so that we can resist the trap of allowing our aspirations as Africans to be shaped by others. I'm not advocating a defensiveness, but rather a proactiveness. Because even the idea of a nation is also about stories. A nation is not geography. A nation is psychology. A nation is really about shared beliefs. A nation without a strong sense of itself cannot thrive. And so we need stories in order to know ourselves. There is rage at the heart of creativity. I experience this sometimes as a simmering, low-burning presence, and other times as a struggle to resist despair. But there is also hope, and it comes from the possibility of what stories can achieve. And I have always believed that there is nothing more essential for the human spirit than hope. Literature is really our last frontier, the story of human motivation. It is difficult to dehumanize a person whose story you have really heard. The story forces you to see them. I worry deeply about the effects of our present epidemic of censorship. Toni Morrison said censorship is like a whole universe being described in invisible ink. I mourn all that has stayed unwritten and unsaid. I like to think of literature as my religion. Reading does not necessarily make us have empathy for others, but it can. And by far the greatest lesson I have learned is how we are more alike than not. That we may show love differently, but we all love. That what matters to us may differ, but we all want to matter. That it is as important to extend grace as it is to expect grace. And that dignity is always as important as food. And I would like to end with some words from one of my favorite writers, the South African Bessie Head. When Bessie Head was asked the question, "Why do you write?" her response was this: "I am building a stairway to the stars. I have the authority to take the whole of mankind up there with me. That is why I write." Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Anyone.